Hello, thank you for being in a new video. This time I have with me the Sony ZV-1F. Let's give it a full review. Let's get started. Marcial, this is a compact camera that's primarily intended for content creators. So Sony has changed some things, simplified other details to make it a little more basic experience, not so complex and with so many things. So also at the same time, it may cause the more experienced to feel that this camera is too basic. I must say that it is not a recent model as it was launched in 2022, but you know I like to review products anyway, even if they were not released recently. So at its launch, its price was 11,499 pesos in Mexico. That's about $670, although remember that the prices here are not the same as over there. But time has passed, so currently you can find it for about 9,149 pesos. That's about $536 to give you more or less an idea. Although I insist, the prices here are not the same as over there. Having known the price, what do you think if you join me to know every detail of this camera? As I anticipated, this is a fairly compact camera, which in fact also feels very light. With the battery included, it weighs 256 grams. And to give you a clearer reference of how compact it is, see how it looks compared against the iPhone 15 Pro Max. It's definitely very compact, although it's obviously not going to be as thin as a cell phone. In this case, we have a thickness of 46.4 millimeters. It's made of polyester and recycled plastics, so Sony takes into account all this stuff that's developing nowadays of using recycled materials, and I think it has achieved a product with a good design, without a doubt. On the bottom side, we will find the traditional mount, to be able to fit it on a tripod or some other accessories. We have on this side the battery tray, which as you can see is a small and simple battery. In this case, it's obviously not going to be a very remarkable point, but the good thing is that as in practically all cameras, you can interchange it, so you can buy several batteries and take them charged to your trips. In this part, we also have the possibility to place the SD card. And we find a small grip as well, which can make it easier for you to hold the camera while you are taking pictures or recording a video. On this side, we are also going to find some ports and slots. First, we have the 3.5mm jack for connecting an external microphone. Then we find the USB-C port. We are grateful that it is USB-C because Sony in many models was still placing micro USB. So in this case, you can possibly charge the camera with your cell phone charger, and you can even connect it to a power bank while you are recording. In case the battery is too small for you, you can perfectly well continue working with external batteries. And finally, something new is that it also has a micro HDMI output. So you can connect an external monitor or connect it to a capture device to have streaming video. In this case, its output is 2160p. That is, you can output a 4K signal so that you can use it in live broadcasts or something similar. But if you do not have a capture device, do not worry, because through the USB-C port, you can also connect it to the computer and it will work as an external camera. You can detect it immediately that way, but in this case, the output will only be in HD. So it's a much simpler output in resolution, but it can help you anyway if you want to use it as a complementary camera in some live broadcasts. One absence to note is that it does not have NFC, unlike other Sony cameras, to quickly link it to a smartphone. But it will be a camera with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, so it can perfectly be connected to your cell phone through the application that we will see later. Regarding the LED indicators, we only have the power button with this LED to indicate when the camera is on. And on the front side, you can see how it has a red LED to indicate when the recording is active. This can be very useful because in many occasions it happens that you think that the camera is recording and in reality it is not recording, but here it is well thought out. And in fact, the screen will also show you a red outline when it is recording, so it can be quite useful in that sense. By the way, the screen is about 3 inches. It's a TFT panel like on many Sony cameras. It's a screen that I think is going to give us sufficient visibility. Although speaking of that, it doesn't have a specific viewfinder, so that's a weak point for those who like photography more and create a viewfinder. But one positive thing about the screen is that it's fully flip up, so you can just pull it out like this. It can be rotated so you can use it and adjust it completely to your liking. Whether you want to record yourself precisely like in vlog mode or you want to use it as a more traditional screen on the backside. In this case, you will also notice that it is a touch screen. As you can see, you can turn the touch controls on or off so you can have an easier adjustment. For example, of the zoom, you can control it from this way, or you can also control it with the manual modes. So much of the interface is well adapted to be used in this way, but always in this part, it can also show you the ways to navigate in the system, which we will see later. For now, you should know that it is not a camera resistant to dust or water, so you have to take the necessary care. And on the top, like any camera, we will find most of its controls. Here there are microphones, there is the on-off button, the mode buttons, button to start video capture, and button to take the picture, with the intermediate pressure to focus and also the slider to zoom. Although the zoom is not very remarkable in this camera, but we will talk about that later. The side I was missing to show you simply has the speaker, which by the way is weak, but we'll talk about that too in a moment. It's time to talk about everything that has to do with audio, so let's start with the microphones that are placed at the top. They are specifically 3 capsules to capture the audio. They are very good, although obviously if there is a lot of wind, it may be necessary that you place an accessory that comes included in the box. Although in this case I do not have it at hand, but it is to prevent the wind gets to distort much your audio, so it can become very useful. Although you know that most people will recommend that you use external microphones for a much more accurate capture of your audio, and for those cases it is very good that the connector is included so you can connect external microphones. So below you are going to hear a test with the built-in microphones and another test with external microphones, although obviously the audio quality of external microphones will depend on which model you are using. In this case I will be using DJI microphones.
Esta es una prueba de los micrófonos que tiene integrados esta cámara. Estoy en un ambiente donde no hay viento, pero se escuchan algunos pajaritos de repente, un poco de naturaleza. Es un ambiente tranquilo, pero estoy hablando directamente con estos micrófonos. Ahora esta es la prueba utilizando un micrófono externo. Estoy en el mismo ambiente, aunque se escucha mi bebé llorando a lo lejos, aunque ya se calmó en este momento. Es un audio obviamente que va a ser más direccional y esa es la ventaja de poder conectarle un micrófono externo. Vas a tener siempre un audio mucho mejor, sobre todo cuando estás en entornos más ruidosos. Tal vez en este entorno donde tenemos un ambiente silencioso, vamos a tener una experiencia muy similar, pero siempre viene muy bien tener el conector externo para un micrófono.
And the speaker is going to give us good sound for reviewing content. I think the volume is loud enough considering it's a camera where generally the speakers sound very low. So when you're reviewing a video, this is where you can adjust the volume. It has 15 levels. Obviously at the highest setting you can hear it, but it's not loud enough. Besides, the quality is very simple. It feels a bit hollow audio, but all cameras are going to offer you speakers of this style. It's not that common to play content directly from the camera, so for just reviewing content you might find it useful. Let's start by talking about photography. For that, I'm going to tell you that it has a 20 megapixel Exmor RS CMOS sensor with a 3:2 ratio. The lens is a 6 that has variable aperture from f2.0 to f8.0. So that's very good steps. It's a fully fixed 20mm lens, so it doesn't have variable zoom. And these 20mm are equivalent in the 35mm format because obviously it's not a full frame camera, but it does give us a good range. The photographs that this camera gives us in general are of good quality. In this case, we are looking at an outdoor photograph. The level of detail will be superior to a lot of smartphones, especially in automatic mode, because here it gives us 20 megapixels. So somehow we can crop the image a little bit to reframe it while maintaining a good level of detail. Although if we get much more detailed, we notice that there is quite a bit of chromatic aberration present, a little bit of noise even in these good lighting conditions. So I don't consider it a spectacular camera yet. It's an entry-level camera for those who want to start creating content, but even some distortions are noticeable at the edges. So the truth is that it's not that much of a quality lens. You are also quite limited in the zoom as it only offers you a zoom of 1.5 1.5x. Too short, obviously it is digital zoom, but in this case it does get to keep all the quality. That's why it is a rather short zoom. On the other hand, you can, in the settings, which can be a bit tricky, enable a higher zoom option, which will let you get up to 4x digital zoom and still look very good. So I would like this option to be enabled by default, because anyone who doesn't have the knowledge will be left with the idea that the maximum zoom is 1.5x. Scenes with movements come out completely sharp, there is no sweeping in the image. So in this sense, it does give us a good experience. Indoors, the picture also looks of good quality, although there is much more noise present, especially in darker areas. Although fortunately, it does maintain color saturation well. By the way, if you take your photos outdoors, we're going to have excellent quality with a natural blur applied to the background that looks great, although if you are a little further away from the camera, the blur effect will be much less intense, but it still looks good. However, notice how in the backlit areas the image will be completely burned out. So you need to be in optimal conditions if you want this level of results that look totally spectacular because of the same optics that generate this nice blur in the background. But in this kind of backlit scenes, definitely that the result is not positive, especially compared against smartphones that usually take better pictures in these conditions. Even if you are not very close to the camera, it still performs very poorly in backlit conditions anyway. Consider that this camera doesn't allow raw photos, unlike higher-end Sony cameras, so you could improve these types of photos in post-production. But in this case, you can't do anything to improve the result. So backlighting simply behaves very badly. At night, we are going to notice again this same bad behavior in backlight because the light sources are going to come out completely burnt, and even the dark areas come out with a lot of noise. So I really didn't like the photography at night. In the darker areas where there are no lights present, I think the result is positive. Not with so much detail, but it was definitely a complicated photograph. And let's say that in selfie format, the result will obviously be positive. We have a good level of detail in the face, although there is still noise present. In fact, it is an exaggerated noise in the darker areas, but it is the price to pay in exchange for having a good level of detail in the face. So, if you want this camera to take pictures specifically, I think it will only be recommended if you're going to have good lighting, because if you're in backlit environments, it's not going to have a good result. However, the natural blur that this lens generates is very nice for such a compact camera format. Also for macro photography, it gives us an excellent result. Look at the tremendous level of detail we have in this photograph. And even if you are more knowledgeable, you can go into the manual settings to change the aperture all the way down to f8.0. This way you have an even more even focus on these kinds of tiny objects. So the result, believe me, in this case is totally superior to what a smartphone could give you. In this case, we do not find a panoramic photography mode. Obviously, having a completely more advanced optics, you can get to blur the background a little while keeping the foreground in focus in a natural way. Unlike smartphones, that is a simulation. But because of the nature of the lens, it doesn't get to be such an aggressive blur in the background. In fact, it has a special button with which you can focus or blur the background. But notice that in this case, it's the out of focus mode. And here you have the in-focus mode. The difference is actually very low, unless you're a little bit closer so that the blur becomes a little bit more intense. But believe me, the results don't look as attractive as you could achieve with more professional lenses. And for video recording, this camera will be able to give us video in 4K at 30 frames per second, or also in 24 frames per second for a slightly more cinematic style. We will find digital stabilization thanks to the steady shot functions, but remember that in this case it may have a crop, so a slightly closer shot will appear. If you want a wider shot, you'll have to turn off the stabilization. But you can definitely get to notice a lot of movement because it doesn't have any optical stabilization. In addition to shooting video in 4K, you can shoot video in full HD only if you want something a little bit simpler. And it's an 8-bit video, so you can just lower the video quality a little bit so it's not so heavy, but it still can't get to a 10-bit video, although at this price point we obviously wouldn't expect something more advanced. And as far as video recording is concerned, the quality is definitely going to be very good. True to Sony's style, we have a video with good colors. If you're in good light conditions, the lens has no problems with focusing. But specifically what I like most are the colors. I think they are quite accurate and very good. But notice how indoors the focus can struggle a lot more. There is even more noise present, and there is a noticeable movement with a slightly slow shutter speed. So the result doesn't convince me 100%, although it maintains color saturation well. And in backlit situations, just like in the photograph, notice that it is not able to balance highlights and shadows well. So it gives priority to illuminating the face. And even if it stops detecting the face, it is not noticeable that it exposes those areas well. In addition, even in backlight, you can notice that it has some problems in the focus. That's why I'm not completely convinced by the camera. Although being a Sony camera, you can obviously use different color profiles that will allow you to have a much more advanced color management in post-production. However, this requires more knowledge because otherwise the video will look extremely pale. So let's say that if you are an expert, you could have better results in backlighting. The same will happen if you are shooting in selfie mode. You can enable this color profile, and in this case, the dynamic range is very high. The result can be very positive, but you need a good video editor. Maybe if you don't have the knowledge, but you have someone to edit your videos who knows about color correction and these things, you could have a good result for your blogs. And in the evenings, we're also gonna notice that the focus struggles a lot. Honestly, I wouldn't highly recommend this camera if you wanna shoot in these kinds of conditions. I don't like the focus, and it's not able to balance highlights and shadows well either. What I did like about this camera is that in darker areas, it is capable of recovering a lot of light, although it does slow down the shutter speed too much and the movement can feel a bit strange. In fact, you may notice this more if you are recording in selfie mode, which by the way comes out very well if you have a good light source towards your face. The result is going to be attractive, but again, the focus can get more confused than usual, and if you go to darker scenes, you will notice the same as I had already mentioned. It's spectacular how much light you can recover, but more noise will appear, and the movement also looks a bit strange having such a slow shutter speed. So you definitely do need good lighting to have a higher quality video. Also, when there are sudden changes in lighting, it takes quite a while to reset the exposure correctly. The camera includes Sony stabilization, which I think is good just for very subtle movements, but even when walking it does feel a bit too strong, and when running it feels even more shaky in the video. Although in general terms it does stabilize well, especially in these scenes with a lot of action, considering that it is a video in 4K. And if what attracts you to this camera is the button with which you can focus or blur the background, believe me, it is not so spectacular. In general, the background is almost always going to come out in focus unless you're very close to the camera. Notice this is the maximum blur that is generated, but again, due to the instability of the focus, it will at times bring the background back into focus and out of focus again. If you are very close to the camera, I insist that the effect is very nice with respect to the blur that can be generated, but that is natural in virtually any device. So, I don't consider this option a buying factor since it even has a hard time keeping the focus correctly. It also has a fast camera mode that can go from something very basic like 3.5x, with which you could record people's movements very nicely, up to 30x. However, its settings are quite complex, unlike a smartphone where it's much simpler to select the settings, as you have to enter S&Q mode and then go into all the settings and set how many frames per second you want, rather than a simpler setting. The same will be true for the slow motion mode. You need to have enough camera knowledge for you to be able to use this mode. It is capable of recording in Full HD at 120 frames per second. So the slow motion is not that spectacular, but obviously you can record for quite a long time. So again, the result is positive, but the setup and accessing this recording mode can become very complex for people who are not that knowledgeable in handling a camera. Finally, I wanted to do a focus test to show you how the focus is quite slow. Even as you go through, it doesn't feel like I'm focusing quickly. It can take a long time to adjust the focus. So, personally, I'm not that satisfied with this camera. Next, let's get to know the software or the operation of this camera, because even though Sony has tried to simplify several things, it still keeps some things that might be complex for a bit basic users. Notice that the moment you turn the camera on, it will immediately go into one of the 3 modes that appear on the second button. So the camera is super simplified in modes because it only offers photo, video, and S&Q, which would be to record slow motion or fast motion. And in this case, the camera will turn on from the last mode you have left. So in this case, it's in S&Q mode, which is for slow motion or fast motion. And with this simple button, you can switch between the different modes. In this case, it's in photo mode, and I'm going to switch to video mode. Obviously, it's going to give priority to the automatic settings, so basic users shouldn't be worrying about shutter speed, aperture, ISO, or compensation. But if you want a much more specific setting, you have to head to the section of the menu called Shooting. Obviously, it also has touch control, so it doesn't necessarily have to be through this wheel, but generally one is used to controlling it from here. In this category, you go to the shot mode, and finally here you can switch between the different modes. It can be a programmed one, an aperture priority one, an exposure time priority one, or fully manual. Obviously here you have to be much more knowledgeable because you can manipulate the aperture, which as I mentioned can go from f2.0 to f8, and you can also switch to select the shutter speed. If you choose over here the right button, we're going to be able to change the ISO, which can go up to a pretty high ISO, 12,800. But obviously these are much more complex settings for basic users, so Sony has hidden them a little bit. The function button will also give you access to some basic settings like microphone volume. We're also going to find the type of focus, whether you want it to be automatic or fully manual. Although in manual focus, so there isn't a very precise way to focus. In that sense, the experience definitely feels very basic. It just locks the focus where it had left off. So ideally you'd want to be on autofocus, and when it's focused on what you want to record and you don't want it to move, switch to manual focus. So it's a pretty simple feel in that regard. It also allows you to add some area of focus, select some exposure compensation, change the ISO, and something that Sony adds on these cameras that are targeted at content creators is the product presentation mode, which you can basically also control with this button that's on the top. This product presentation mode will make the focus react quickly when you bring something close to the camera, so you're not going to have to be struggling too much to show some object, but the camera will quickly focus unless you have it turned off. And another thing that Sony makes it easy to change is the background blur effect. In this case, you have a simple button that will change the aperture. In this case, as you notice, it even changes the icon that shows the aperture, and now it simply shows that you have either the sharp style or the background blur style. So these are 2 modes that you can easily select with this button. And finally, we have the zoom slider, which, as I had already told you, it's a pretty limited and very simple zoom. So more or less, those are the options we have in this part. I also forgot to mention to you here the stabilization issue, or also the soft skin effect or beauty mode as we might know it in other devices, which can become useful as well because it keeps the resolution well. And we are also going to find the white balance, which the most advisable will be to leave it on automatic, but obviously also allows you to change it, in addition to creative styles, where we find some filters that we can go applying to show different colors. So if you want to give a different look to your videos from the moment you record them, you could select any of these settings. Almost to finish, we will find the image profile that could help you for much more professional videos and colorize them later. Note that it brings a wide variety of supported profiles to have more dynamic range, although obviously this is already applied for a much more advanced editing of your videos in post-production. So those are the options we have in this camera quickly, and from here you could also change the recording mode, which I insist most people will keep it in intelligent automatic mode, and that's it. From the same screen, you can start recording video even though you have a dedicated physical button for that. And likewise here, it gives you the suggestion of basic controls that I mentioned a moment ago. It even has a timer, so you can start your video with a little bit of a timeout, although it seems a little strange to see the gallery button inside the screen and it's very close to the button that's off the screen. So I feel there's a bit of duplicity here in the interface, but Sony does it surely because many people are used to touch controls. In fact, the zoom setting also strikes me as very curious that Sony has placed it this way. You can touch the screen and also quickly access some presets, or you can zoom a bit more fluidly with the slider on top. In photo mode, it's gonna have a very similar operation to what I was already telling you from the video. In this part, you can take the picture. It also has the zoom controls, although you can also disable all this with this little button to simplify the viewfinder a little more. You can also touch the screen to focus on an object and follow it. And in this part, it also has multiple captures if you want a continuous capture or if you want to activate a timer to take your photos. And finally, the S&Q mode, which is for slow motion or fast motion. From my point of view, it is the one that should be simplified because in this case it brings very professional settings that can be difficult to understand for several people. As you notice, it comes in automatic mode, but also manually you can give it program mode, aperture priority, or manual exposure. But in this case it is difficult for the user to know if it is in slow motion or fast motion, so you have to access the menu and go to this part of the S&Q mode settings. And notice in this case it's simply going to tell us how it's going to be at 24, 30 or 60 frames per second, and finally the speed. In this case 60 frames per second could be a 50% speed setting to have a sort of slow motion as long as it's at 30 frames per second here, or 120, which would be an even slower camera, or 1 frame per second would be fast motion. But honestly, I insist that these settings can be a bit complex for a user who is not so expert. Although in this part at the bottom it tells us watch, in this case it would be fast motion 2x if you want the frames per second, but if you want it to be 30, here it will show you how the result would be. Slow motion 4x if you select 120, or at the bottom, fast motion 30x. That would be the fastest it could go. So in this aspect, I sincerely believe that the experience will be much faster or more understandable for a simple user from a cell phone than from a camera. And it also has an option to add items to your menu to simplify a bit, or if you use a lot some functions, you can add them to the menu in a much simpler way. We have 6 slots to add items there. And if not, you can also access all the settings, which I insist in this type of camera has many parameters to be configured. Even the color or the tone with the creative aspects, how you want the focus to behave, you can also configure it. For example, you can tell it to emphasize human recognition for a faster focus. Or also if you're going to capture animals, you can change the focus shot. You can also edit how the gallery behaves, the connectivity with your smartphone, and configure simpler things like the date and other things. Even the monitor, notice that it can have a different brightness, so it has multiple brightness levels, but it's a little bit hidden. So more or less these are the options directly from the camera, but now let's connect the camera to the cell phone so you can see how its application is. To connect the camera to the cell phone, we must go to the specific menu in this part of the world, and finally we put smartphone registration, and here it will show us a QR so we can download the application. As you can see, the application has changed its name and is now called Creators App. Let's download it so you can see more or less if it connects easily or not. Let's go through the setup process, accept the privacy policy, and you can also sign up for a Sony membership to get 25 gigabytes of cloud storage. In this case, I'm just going to put in that I want to do that later. Sony always asks for more details from you. If you want to give it to them, it can be, I'm just going to put that I already want to connect. We're going to give you full access to our pictures, and now we're going to connect to the camera. We are going to select next and choose the model of this camera, which as you know is a simple camera within the category of vlog cameras ZV-1F. After giving it all the permissions, it gives us the instructions in this part, and that's where we've already gotten to previously on the camera. So I'm going to select that. I already want to register the cell phone, and finally in this part the camera should connect to the cell phone. But since in this case it doesn't go to the next step, I guess the camera is out of date, since in this case it sends me to install Imaging Edge Mobile Plus, but here it is telling me that it should send me to download the Creators app, so I'm pretty sure this camera is out of date and that's why it can't do connectivity. These kind of little details, I feel Sony should fix them so that updates install much easier on their camera, because now I have to head to the update section, because as you realize it has version 1.0 and I need a more current version, but as you realize there is no way to install updates easily directly from the camera. The ideal would be to connect it to the Wi-Fi network and update it easily, but now I have to update it manually from the computer, and that is a much more complex process, which I will not add to this video because it would take too long, so I'll come back after I have updated it. That's it, I've updated the camera and we're going to restart this setup process so you can finally link up. As you can see, the camera already appears. I just put connect and the connection is ready. So the only issue here was having to update the camera, which is not so complex, but for a user who may not have so much knowledge may be a little complicated. In the application, it will show us the current status of the battery and the memory card. We can also select remote shooting and observe how it will automatically connect to the camera. We will select the button here and it takes a few seconds to finish this process, and that's it. Through the cell phone we can have the camera viewfinder, and as you can see it goes with very little latency. Obviously if you're on a slower device, but I like it. In fact, in this case it has just been disconnected, so it seems that it does not have the best possible stability, but as you can see we can also rotate the view, and we have in this part all the controls, so we also have manual controls and everything that we already saw from the camera. We are also going to find an option to import the pictures or videos that we have taken from the camera. We are going to select this option and observe how it is connecting. It tells us in this case what kind of videos we can copy. That being a simple camera, in this case we can copy absolutely everything. Then notice how here we can explore these videos. We can't play them until after we have copied them. Then we can select them, and finally with this button they are going to be imported. The pictures are going to be imported by default in 2 megapixels, so it is important that if you want to keep the full resolution, go to the option to change settings so that you choose the original resolution setting, and after that finally the information is going to be passed. The transfer is not very fast, so you have to have good patience. In this case it is a quite short video, and notice how it still takes quite a long time. So in this aspect, I think it could also improve maybe having a faster connection speed, because it really seems that here the information is sent very slowly. So I will wait, and after I finish the transfer, I will show you the results. It finally finished, and I insist that the transfer is exaggeratedly slow because it really looks like the videos were. We're going to explore them in this part, and it was only a 9-second video and it really took a long time. Obviously in this case, if you are transferring in the original quality, but if you want to use clips in a faster way when making the copy, it would be advisable to record in full HD and not in 4K, because the truth is very annoying to have to be waiting so long, especially considering that on iPhone you could not do anything else, because if you leave the application the transfer will be cancelled. Fortunately, on Android you could at least open some apps on top of it to entertain yourself for a while, but on iPhone things are quite a bit more complicated. Still, note the tremendous image quality that this device gives us is really the price to pay in exchange for having this quality. So that's basically what we can do with this camera. For the moment we have reached the end of this video. If you liked it, you know you can tell us, and we'll see you next time.